Welcome to the Kimberlite webinar to take a comprehensive look at the subsea services market. My name is David Batt, President of Kimberlite Research, and I'm glad you can join us today. This is the 28th webinar in the Kimberlite webinar series that we've hosted on behalf of the oil and gas operators who participate in our industry research. These webinars are provided as a professional courtesy and a thank you to the many oil and gas operators around the world who participate in these industry surveys. In past webinars, we discussed the United States hydraulic fracturing market, international drilling services, global artificial lift, and most recently, the intervention services market, along with a comprehensive review of the Big Four oil field service providers. Let us know if you or your colleagues need access to any of these prior webinars. Send us an email or chat message today. We also collaborate with many oil and gas operators worldwide. We're glad to provide customized presentations to your company as well. Just let us know and reach out to us. Today, we'll be taking a deep dive into the technology trends and supplier performance for subsea services, including subsea equipment maintenance and repair, ROV services, IWOX landing strings, and multi-phase flow meters. Feel free to submit questions during the presentation via the chat box, or you can email us directly, and we'll address your questions during the presentation. For those of you that are not as familiar with Kimberlite Research, I'll provide a brief background and then dive into the review. Kimberlite provides voice of customer feedback each year via personal one-on-one interviews. Some of you on the webinar today may have participated in one of our industry studies, and for that, I say thank you. But each year, we conduct about 3,000 interviews globally. To date, we've interviewed over 17,000 users of oil field services and have over 700,000 supplier performance ratings to perform our analytics. Through these interviews, we produce a series of reports dealing with formation evaluation, drilling and completion, production, and subsea. Today, we'll be focusing on the subsea market, and the results findings I'll be sharing with you today are based on interviews most recently conducted with over 130 subsea customers around the world who in aggregate manage over 4,000 subsea wells. The performance trends that I'll be sharing with you today from 2016 through 2023 are based on about 500 customer interviews in the subsea services market and are based on over 17,000 supplier performance ratings. The data set is rich and multidimensional. In this exhibit, we cross-plot supplier performance on the horizontal x-axis versus pricing competitiveness on the vertical y-axis. The value map, as we refer to it, is something we'll be using quite a bit today. So I just want to explain the four quadrants real quick. Any oil field service companies that plot in the top right-hand quadrant are viewed as premium suppliers. They perform better than the industry average through the eyes of the end users, i.e. your peers in the industry. And they may charge a little bit more, but they cost more to be worth it. Bottom left, a discount provider, perform below industry average but have attractive pricing, so you get what you pay for. Bottom right, value advantaged. And top left would be any oil field service company who, through the eyes of the end users, their value propositions being challenged in terms of their performance and pricing. Any oil field service company provider that plots in the top left-hand quadrant really needs to improve performance or maybe reassess their pricing strategies. If you're an oil and gas operator, naturally you're looking for service providers that can provide you and your company best value. So commonly looking for suppliers that perform either industry average or better, or perhaps for fit for purpose needs over here in the bottom left. Now, to kick things off, what I'd like to do is maybe take a look at operator sentiment for subsea services. When you look at the diffusion index for subsea services, you'll find that the diffusion indices is well above the critical 50 mark at 73.50, and you have about 57% of the subsea operators worldwide reporting to us through the survey that they'd like to hold their subsea services expenditures flat over the next 12 months versus the past 12 months. And about another third, 57% planning to increase and 33% trying to hold flat. Trying to hold flat, when you have aging infrastructure and you're adding assets to your infrastructure, is a really daunting task, and we'll talk more about that. The average increase in expenditures for subsea services is going to be about close to 4% this year. When you look at the fusion index for subsea services in the blue line, you see how relatively resilient it is from year to year. It doesn't necessarily fluctuate as volatilely as drilling services, where we go from contraction mode from the downturn of 2015 back to expansion, back into contraction mode of the COVID year of 2020, back into expansion mode, and now we're kind of moderating again here. Subsea services are services that are required both in good times and bad times in order to maintain the productivity of wells. Taking a quick look forward at the broader drilling services index, we'll be publishing our drilling services reports here in the next 20 days or so, dealing with mud motors and rotary steerables and drill bits. But if you look at the diffusion indices amongst the offshore operators in blue and the international land operators in this yellow color, what you find is that investment is still strong internationally and offshore as operators are seeking to restore lost production capacity following several years of underinvestment, whereas operator sentiment in U.S. land, North America land has been declining, but moderating at fairly high levels. So we're clearly beginning to see a bifurcation in the broader market. Turning back to subsea services, and when we ask the subsea operators around the world, what technologies or approaches are delivering them the best overall experiences and improving their subsea life of field economics, what we find is it's an unaided question, so the oil and gas operators are free to mention as many areas where they're experiencing some benefit. When we read through the many verbatim comments and place them in the categories, what we find here is operators are talking about rigless operations and interventions, many of which are riserless, and then digital, AI, digitization, data analytics, followed by monitoring, sensors, and remote operations. Monitoring and sensors and remote operations also have a digital theme to it. So if you add AI, digitization, data analytics, along with monitoring, sensors, and remote operations, you're clearly beginning to see that the subsea operators are talking about the digital theme in the areas of digital and data analytics beginning to really deliver some very positive benefits for the industry. When we ask the question about looking forward a little bit into the future, about how subsea developments of the future will be different than the way we operate today, again, it's another open-ended question. But again, we find digital at the top of the list, and we find that remote operations and automation and drones, which also are digitally related, clearly digital is at the top, and then we find all electric systems sitting in second place in that regard. But what strikes me as interesting is if you go back to the survey that we first conducted for Subsea Services in 2016, and we updated this Subsea Services study in 19, 21, and 23. Well, back in 16, the subsea oil and gas operators around the world, nobody was mentioning digitization and AI. No one was mentioning all electric systems or automation and robots and drones or even carbon neutrality. And so you start to see a material shift in how the subsea oil and gas operators are tilting their investments more towards digital and type investments. Back in 2016, a lot of the commentary about how we're going to improve the future of subsea operations into the future was wrapped around improved component life and design. So that kind of brought about standardization and lighter, smaller footprints and all the benefits that you see in like a Technip FMC 2.0 or a OneSubsea or similar or a Baker Hughes Upterra. But you see a decline in focus on the component equipment design that you see more along the digital thing. Now, when we ask the subsea oil and gas operators point blank, hey, where should the subsea suppliers be focusing their investments? Top priority, secondary priority to help meet your needs, because the oilfield service providers, they only have so many resources that they can invest in. And so that brings up a point. One of the things we really would like to emphasize in these webinars with the oil and gas operators is the need to really proactively collaborate with the oilfield service providers, particularly in a tightening market that we're seeing in the offshore space, where there is a limited capacity of qualified equipment and people to perform the work, but yet there's a long life of projects that need to get done. So, please continue to collaborate with your suppliers, because the feedback from the subsea oil and gas operators here are basically for the subsea suppliers to continue to make a top priority investments to support remote operations support at the top, followed by digital and then rigless interventions. Now, all this focus on digital is also beginning to translate into the budgets of a typical subsea oil and gas operator's services budget. When you take a look at a typical services budget of a subsea oil and gas operator, digital makes up about a quarter of their budget, 23%, either in monitoring subsea equipment on the seafloor or downhole wellbore. And equipment maintenance and repair and downhole well interventions makes up about 50% of their budget. Now, what's interesting is, this is 23, if you go to 2016 when we first conducted our first survey for Subsea Services, digital made up 4%, and equipment repair and maintenance and downhole workovers made up close to 80% or 78% here. And so clearly you're starting to see a shifting, if you will, as digital spend investments begin to increase and operators is beginning to use data analytics and other methods to monitor and to help plan. You're seeing that expenditures are actually going down as part of their budget for workovers and for repairs. So that's very encouraging. It appears that the digital investments are indeed achieving what we're seeking to achieve, and that's to be able to be more proactive in managing our assets. The other thing to think about too is that the average cost annually to maintain a subsea services, maintain a subsea well, is just under about $1 million. And so this number has been holding relatively flat, been trending down actually, but the distribution of the pie has been changing. Okay, so the total size of the pie on a cost per well seems to be trending down ever so slightly, but the distribution of the spend is what's materially changing from 2016 to 2023. Now, the wells that are subsea wells that are less than 10 years of age, they typically are lower cost to maintain, and wells that are more than 10 years are a bit higher cost to maintain. About half the costs are associated with rig and vessels. When we take a look at where the subsea oil and gas operators are getting the biggest return on investment, it used to be in the prior years, particularly 2019 and 21, subsea tiebacks was where subsea oil and gas operators reported getting some of the highest returns on investment. But in the 23 report, we see some shifting towards workovers and interventions that we spoke about earlier, more monitoring, and then comes subsea tiebacks. Turning to ESG, because the deep water barrels are oftentimes promoted as being lower carbon barrels to the industry and more broadly. And what we find is that the ESG diffusion indices sits really highly in the 80% range, 83.5, which is nearly 5-10 points higher than the average ESG diffusion index for the broader oil and gas industry. So the subsea oil and gas operators are certainly investing more in the ESG at a slightly faster pace than the broader oil and gas industry. But with that said, the subsea oil and gas operators are focusing their spending around emissions monitoring and reduction, but also in the use of renewables. It could be a floating wind offshore to help power the FPSO and the equipment, coupled with some carbon storage and capture and storage to help create a zero carbon impact. And so the nice thing about these subsea deep water assets is the ability to generate long-term reserves, long-term production, and be able to have a fairly minimum impact from a carbon perspective. When we ask these subsea oil and gas operators which suppliers are best able to help them in achieving their ESG objectives, what we find is that Schlumberger SLB OneSubsea is most heavily cited due to their technology and digital capabilities, followed by Oceaneering because of their ROV and inspection services and project management capabilities allows the subsea oil and gas operators to really minimize impact and footprint when they're conducting their operations, followed by TechnipFMC. One more area I'd like to touch on is the impact of the alliances between the vessel contractors and the subsea equipment suppliers. You may recall back in January of 2017 when Technip and FMC came together. That was a pretty major event, and then OneSubsea followed quickly with their alliances with Subsea 7 and the Subsea Integration Alliance. But what we found back in 2016 was, a minority of the folks felt like it was going to have a positive impact, and over the years it's grown to about half of the subsea oil and gas operators with whom we survey and interview say that they're seeing positive impact. So I think this impact of these alliances is pretty well begin to level off at about half the market. Half the people see benefit. The other half see basically no impact. For those that see an impact, however, they do mention some really good benefits, some improved operational integration and execution, and better access to resources and engineering teams, and better availability and time and cost savings. So for the population of subsea oil and gas operators that view these alliances in a positive fashion, that they're getting some benefits, the benefits that they're citing that they are receiving are certainly in alignment with the vision of what was thought about when these alliances were being thought about and being put into place. Clearly, these alliances still have some work to do to convince the other half of the subsea oil and gas operator community that, hey, that this is going to deliver some positive benefits versus seeking out best-in-class providers. And we can talk more about that in a moment. One thing that's important to keep in mind, though, is that the major oil companies up here at the top and the national oil companies here in the middle, they believe that the integrated EPCI agreements really do have the potential to drive down cost. And this bodes really well for companies like TechnipFMC and particularly OneSubsea, where they have tremendous amount of EPCI capabilities and master service and frame agreements in place. And the oil and gas operators, when they select a supplier for subsea completions, they place a lot of value on having an existing MSA frame agreement in place and working with subsea suppliers that have alliances to provide integrated offerings. And so while some operators, particularly in the Gulf of Mexico, would like to have access to independent best-in-class, a lot of the larger subsea operators around the world and Tier 1 NOCs lean very heavily on their frame agreements. When we shift gears here just a little bit and we look at the overall market and brand image of the major subsea suppliers, what we find is that TechnipFMC has very strong brand image strength for being viewed as a leader, if you will, in partnering with subsea operators for cost savings, for technology leadership, for having a full lineup of integrated services. When you get to project management and you get to advanced digital solutions, TechnipFMC's brand image and leadership perception is basically in alignment with their customer base. The 0% line means that their image is in alignment with their customer base. These positive variations to the right reflect that TechnipFMC's image of strength propagates or extends beyond their customer base. TechnipFMC has some market brand image deficits for being viewed as a leader for best ROV services and best support vessels. By contrast, if you take a look at SLB OneSubsea, you see that SLB OneSubsea stands out for having very strong market brand image capabilities for downhole well interventions, as well as having the most advanced digital solutions in the space. They share brand image strengths with TechnipFMC for technology leadership, integrated offerings, and partnering. And then obviously, Subsea OneSubsea has a negative brand image for ROV services, for which they don't provide those services, but through their alliance with Subsea 7, they do provide those services. Baker Hughes' market image and strength is generally in alignment with their customer base, the 0% line that goes down the middle there, coupled with some negative biases. Their strongest negative biases, though, and brand image deficits are with ROV services and support vessels, for which they don't provide, but also for downhole intervention services, for which they do have some great strengths in, but yet their brand image isn't very strong. So certainly some work and opportunities for Baker Hughes to strengthen up their image as it relates to subsea downhole wellbore intervention services. Particularly, these subsea wells typically need a downhole wellbore intervention on average statistically about every 7 years, and maybe we'll touch on that here in a moment. Aker Solutions has some brand image deficits, but when the transaction closes with OneSubsea, this may become a little bit less of an issue. And then Oceaneering has some really strong brand image strengths for being viewed as best for support vessels and best for ROV services. And their image strength is improving for their digital solutions that we mentioned earlier, as well as for project management. So if you kind of look at the big four in aggregate in terms of their brand image strengths, you can see that TechnipFMC and OneSubsea tend to lead the market with brand image strengths that tend to propagate or extend beyond their customer base. whereas Baker Hughes's market image tends to have some brand image deficits, but tends to correlate pretty closely to their customer base. Turning our attention to subsea equipment maintenance and repair, the areas in which the subsea oil and gas operators are expressing some of their greatest challenges is around subsea fields that are facing obsolescence issues. About 29 to 30% of subsea fields are reported to be facing obsolescence issues, of which control systems is the component that's most contributing to that. In fact, control systems are contributing to obsolescence issues at nearly a 3-to-1 ratio to trees and other electronical components, and then even more so to these other components. As part of the 23 survey, we decided to include a new question, given the criticality and how subsea control systems are contributing to obsolescence, about if a supplier could guarantee that their subsea control system would not become obsolete, how much influence would this have in your supplier selection decision? Well, about 85% of the subsea operators that we interviewed said, hey, that would have, some impact to us. And so there are some disruptors in the market. ProServe, for example, is a company that specializes in refurbishing obsolete and outdated subsea control systems, and they put up a guarantee against obsolescence. And so, competition and innovation is good for help driving this industry to the next level, and we'll talk more about that here in a moment. When we take a look at the components that are typically changed out on a typical subsea well, what we find is that the typical subsea well will have to pull their pods at least twice during the typical life, say a 20-year lifespan, followed by pressure temperature sensors and chokes and valves. You can see the turnaround times to get these components repaired and refurbished is somewhere between the 9 to 12, 16 months range, depending upon the component. You can see that umbilicals and flow lines and full tree refurbishments don't happen very often. Same thing with risers. And we do see that the subsea oil and gas operators are increasing the amount of wells that are being actively monitored for subsea equipment condition monitoring systems. And again, that feeds into the digital thing that we just spoke about. If we fast forward a little bit into the subsea equipment maintenance and repair services sector, what we find, to no surprise, TechnipFMC is the market share leader in the space. And when the subsea oil and gas operators rate the suppliers with whom they're using for subsea equipment maintenance and repair services, we do see some variance in performance. We see no evidence, based on the feedback from the subsea oil and gas operators, that all subsea equipment suppliers are performing at the same level. In fact, when we start to trend the overall performance in this segment from 2016 to 2023, based on 500 different interviews of subsea oil and gas operators globally, and looking at the 17,000 performance ratings, the benchmark, we see some very encouraging signs here. The first thing that we like to look at is the industry average rating, which is the dashed line. If you take a look at 2019 to 2023, what you generally find is that based on the reviews from the customers, the subsea oil and gas operators, performance is improving as an industry. And that's what we like to see, is that the industry is getting better every year. And we see that with field service. We see it with technical support, if you draw the best fit line, and responsiveness to needs. These are all encouraging signs that we as an industry are getting better. You also find that the customer reviews for each of the suppliers can vary from year to year. You see ProServe, which is much smaller than obviously TechnipFMC and OneSubsea, but ProServe, who specializes in subsea control systems and the refurbishment of obsolete control systems, consistently get customer reviews that are better than industry average. And even Baker Hughes and Aker, whose customer reviews have historically trailed the industry benchmark, are also showing signs of improvement. So when we translate this to the competitive landscape that we spoke about earlier, that we're going to be using this value map quite a bit, what we find is that the market share leaders, TechnipFMC and OneSubsea, are clearly viewed as the premium-based suppliers. ProServe down here is a value advantage supplier, along with Oceaneering. Baker Hughes' value proposition is being challenged a bit. If we break this out regionally, we find that a lot of the Gulf of Mexico operators tend to use a lot of the small, the mid-tier, or even best-in-class providers, all others. And you can see that Technip FMC and Schlumberger One Subsea, that their value propositions are being more materially questioned, if you will, in terms of value delivered in the Gulf of Mexico than when you move into the international subsea market, where you see the performance and strength through the eyes of the end users of Schlumberger One Subsea and Technip FMC as being clear market leaders and well positioned to continue to serve this market. Moving to ROV services, the oil and gas operators are citing, it would be great if we could continue to improve reliability of the ROVs, principally through improved maintenance. In many cases, these ROVs may be going on close to back-to-back missions with very little time for maintenance. So we want to make sure that the personnel on board are skilled and trained to provide the maintenance services quickly and maintain proper spares, along with improved tooling capabilities and higher resolution cameras. Now, looking forward, it's true, there's all types of innovative companies out there, from Nauticus Robotics and others, that are coming out with autonomous AUVs and ROVs and uncrewed vessels, and the technology is going in that direction. But in the meantime, you take Oceaneering, for example, with a large fleet of over 200 ROVs. We want to continue to upgrade the fleets that we do have with these advanced capabilities in order to meet the needs of today and into the near term. A lot of these other technologies may take 3, 5, 7, 10 years down the road to become a little bit more commonplace. Oceaneering definitely has the largest market penetration. Nearly 75% of the ROV service users around the world use Oceaneering, and Oceaneering has the largest market share. When we take a look at the performance reviews for ROV service suppliers, we see quite a bit of variance from the top performing suppliers to the bottom performing suppliers, and you see quite a bit of dispersion in the performance profiles of the ROV service suppliers. But again, let's first look at the industry average line. So from 19 to 23, you see responsiveness to needs based on the reviews and the feedback from the subsea oil and gas operators and the users of these services, that the industry as a whole is getting better for responsiveness, getting better for equipment quality and reliability, even though they cite they want even higher levels. Still kind of trending in the right direction for competency of the pilots and the field personnel. Technical support also improving. So again, another great sign. But again, you see quite a bit of dispersion. Oceaneering is here at the top. They're viewed as consistently getting customer reviews every survey year that's better than industry average and rather stable. You get other ROV suppliers whose performance tends to move a little bit up and down from survey year to survey year. So again, I really encourage the oil and gas operators to collaborate with their service suppliers. Every service supplier has strengths and weaknesses. Every project for an oil company has particular needs. Trying to match up a supplier's strengths to your needs in order to get best value is very, very important. When you take a look at the overall competitive landscape, you'll find that Oceaneering is not only dominant in market share, clearly, but they also are viewed fairly consistently as a performance leader in delivering very strong value. And in fact, Oceaneering from year to year has consistently positioned themselves as one of the more premium-based suppliers, and the value actually improved in the last from survey to survey year. Turning our attention to downhole well interventions really quick, what we find is that the typical subsea well operates about 6.6 years, say 7 years, before they require a well intervention. And that subsea operators report that they typically will plan for about 3 subsea wellbore interventions during the life of a typical subsea well. Now, the problems that these subsea wells are experiencing that affect the productivity of the well include corrosion and deposit control, and sand and mechanical failures, downhole equipment failures, and tubing and casing leaks. And we find that as the cost for drilling rigs has increased over the last few years, the use of a drilling rig for a well intervention is declining, and the use of the vessels is increasing. Now, back when drilling rigs, from the 15 downturn and then the 2020 COVID upset, the rig rates were, much lower, and many people opted just to use a drilling rig. to do the workovers. But I think moving forward, we'll see greater and greater use and adoption of these specialty vessels that are really designed to very efficiently show up on a site and perform the work. Drilling rigs can do the work, but once they finish drilling a well and they kind of take a pause on the drilling campaign to go do an intervention job, rigging up, rigging down, and having that specialty expertise, they're just not as efficient as vessels that are geared to go off and do certain particular specialized services for a well. If we take a look at IWOCs and landing strings and multi-phase flow meters really quick, what we find is that the market share leaders, Oceaneering and SLB, OneSubsea, are really positioned as the premium-based suppliers. Technip FMC, Aker Solutions, and ProServe are also viewed as delivering strong value. We do see some regional dispersion, like in the Gulf of Mexico, for example. Oceaneering's value proposition is being challenged a bit. ProServe looks strong, whereas if you move internationally, Halliburton and Baker Hughes' value propositions are beginning to become challenged in the eyes of the end users, whereas the other suppliers are viewed as delivering best value. Moving the landing strings, what we find is that market share leaders, SLB, OneSubsea, and Expro, are the premium-based suppliers, and then there's a supplier called PRT Offshore. They tend to focus quite a bit in the Gulf of Mexico, but they are expanding internationally, are viewed as delivering really strong value. And when you move internationally, you find that the major suppliers, Expro and SLB, OneSubsea, along with Technip and Baker, are all viewed as delivering strong value. And Halliburton's value proposition is being challenged a little bit more than the rest of the pack there. For multi-phase flow meters, we have about 50% of the subsea wells amongst a sample of operators with whom we're interviewing cite use of multi-phase flow meters, with about a third, 31%, considering use of the virtual subsea flow meter. This market's pretty consolidated amongst three major suppliers. As you may recall, SLB purchased Framo, Technip FMC purchased MPM, and then Emerson, I believe, with their Roxar. But you can see that SLB and Technip FMC are viewed as delivering very similar performance, very similar value. With Emerson, although having maybe a little bit smaller market share, is also viewed as providing a little bit more disproportionate value to the positive side versus SLB and Technip FMC. Turning our attention briefly to plugging and abandonment and decommissioning, what we find is that the subsea oil and gas operators, when they self-describe themselves as being proactive or not proactive with having a plug-in and abandonment program, rating themselves on a scale of 1 to 10, and going back to the 2019 survey, very few people self-describe themselves as having a very proactive plug-in and abandonment program in 2019. But the subsea operators seem to be increasing in terms of their proactiveness based on their own self-assessment of themselves, I might add. But as you realize, plug-in and abandonment can vary from a regulatory perspective. Like in Australia, they have very strict regulations and time constraints, and everything has to come off the seafloor. Whereas in other regions, like in the Gulf of Mexico, working with the regulatory agencies, there may be opportunities to create artificial reefs and do things in order to make the decommissioning process go a little bit more smoothly and contribute to the environment in a proactive fashion. We've got about 5% of the wells or less that are described as being idle subsea, and about another 3% temporarily abandoned. And then finally, getting to the end here, we find that when we talk to the subsea oil and gas operators that we're surveying, that we have some visibility for about maybe 200 subsea wells being abandoned over the next 5 years, with another 150 beyond that. But in order to kind of pick up the pace with plugging and abandonment, because no one likes paying for the ultimate end of the life of a well, the funeral. It's not a really fun thing to do. Certainly not you don't get any return on it. So, as we can begin to develop more rigless-based solutions using specialty vessels and collaborating with suppliers, maybe trying to pair up together and do some multi-well campaigns to help collectively as an industry drive our costs down, that will certainly help in this area. And I think just to kind of wrap it up, if I look at the overall competitive landscape, you certainly have the market share leaders, Technip FMC and SLB OneSubsea, generally viewed as delivering strong value. And collectively, they maintain a very large share of the market. Aker Solutions is slated to become part of the SLB One Subsea 7 Alliance here, end of year potentially. Baker Hughes, albeit being viewed a little bit value disadvantaged, with the consolidation taking place with One Subsea and TechnipFMC, certainly Baker Hughes will be the beneficiary of that. But I really share this slide to kind of bring apparent to the oil and gas operators that when you're selecting best value, it's true, you can go to your MSA provider and they can provide an integrated suite of solutions, but it's also true that, for now, we're really blessed in this industry with having a fairly vibrant and competitive marketplace where there's several other suppliers that are recognized for certain best-in-class capabilities, be it ProServe for control systems. Remember I talked about PRT for landing strings, not pictured in this exhibit. Trendsetter for having some really innovative, customized subsea engineering solutions, Masterflow for subsea chokes, Drillquip for subsea wellheads, Oceaneering for ROV services, Expro for landing strings, and Helix for interventions. That you do have optionality, and as you're seeking out best value for your company. And each of these suppliers have particular strengths and weaknesses that you need to be aware of in order to make sure that you're selecting the right supplier to effectively perform your job. We know that we need to continue to invest long term into this industry, that we need to restore lost production capacity. We know that it's going to put a strain on all of the equipment capabilities that we have and people capabilities that we have to continue to perform our work safely. So I really encourage the oil and gas operators and the service suppliers to work as collaboratively as possible, recognizing that there's a finite amount of capital of the subsea service suppliers and oilfield service companies to invest in new technologies. And naturally, there's a finite amount of capital that the oil companies can invest to make these really capital-intensive projects economically work. And so together as an industry, we continue to drive it forward through innovation, collaboration, and technology. It is very clear in this survey that the investments that we're making in digital are helping to bring efficiencies and drive down cost in other traditional areas of equipment repair, maintenance, and workovers. And so it's very pleasing to see that. I want to thank again all the oil and gas operators who participate in our surveys. If anyone has a question about this survey or this report or any of our prior reports, please reach out to Kimberlite. We're more than glad to assist you where we can. So with that, I think we'll sign off here from Kimberlite. Thank you for attending, and reach out to discuss if you want to delve into any one of these issues a little bit more deeply. Thank you very much. Bye now.